I'm Tristan Stubbs with the Climate and Development Knowledge Network in Cancun, Mexico, with Atiq Rahman of the Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies. Atiq, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Could you give me a few words on what your organization does in Bangladesh? Yeah.
I'm the Executive Director of Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies, which is a think tank. It's a research organization which does policy analysis, implementation up to the level of pilot phase, and try to establish the science beyond reasonable doubt. And then we take it to communities and at the level of policies. We connect the different levels of decision making from the absolute communities and ground level to the next tier of local level planning, to the national level where policies are mostly made, to the level of regional multi-country region, which for us South Asia or Asia Pacific, and then we take it to the international, the global level. And one of our strengths is connect decision making across from top to bottom and see interactions. But we work on 4 major themes. The themes are integrating environment and development. So we do a lot of scientific work, but helping to integrate environment and development. We do people's participation and good governance across those levels. And we are working on poverty alleviation, sustainable livelihoods, which is addressing the fundamental poverty questions, and then sustainable markets and public-private partnership, which involves private sector and civil society, social business, and all of those. So those 4 elements for us is sustainable development in action, and we work at different divisions. We have climate change is such a division. We have been one of the early advocates and promoters of adaptation at different levels. So we work on adaptation, climate science, climate development. We are working on modeling of the monsoon from Himalayas down to Bangladesh and the communities. So at the level of science, we are working on a peoples and community-based interaction. We are trying to harmonize the Cartesian scientific knowledge, which is the dominant paradigm of communications, with that of the peoples and community knowledge. And still the globe's farmers, planetary farmers who produce the food for the planet, half of them are still non-literate. So there's a whole knowledge system out there, and climate change, which is changing the world so rapidly, challenges that knowledge system. So we are looking at some of the very fundamental issue of knowledge management with respect to how to connect also knowledge for decision making. And decision making for us, a major decision maker is absolutely the grassroots village, farmer to village head, right up to the Secretary General of the United Nations and presidents of countries. So for us, each of those decision makers matter, and we work with large number of institutions across the world, universities, think tanks, United Nations, World Bank, whatever the types of organization across the world, but much more with the community organization and networks. So we are a knowledge-based institution, but this knowledge is for practice, this knowledge is for working and functioning, and also the whole questions like climate areas. We have been one of the pioneers of the concept of climate justice. How do you push it? The voice of the voiceless, how do you bring it to the discussion parameters in not only in negotiation, but also in scientific understanding of issues.
So you seem to work on quite a number of levels. What are the challenges of this approach?
Oh, the biggest challenge is to communicate. Most of us, we live in our own little world, and the biggest challenge is to expose the larger world of interactions between ecosystems, development, environment, biodiversity, poverty, decision making, that they are one continuous flow, and many of them are in urban areas and working on urban questions, some in coastal areas working on coastal questions, some do just the science but not the policy, and most think tanks do science and policy but do not do implementation.
Right.
How that? One of our other learning over the last 20 years is that after 10 years of working in one of the poorest and probably one of the most progressive and active in terms of civil society actions is Bangladesh. And where we have been asking the question is, how do you do science policy interface? Now in Western democracies and many other places where democracy function well, science policy interface, science taking into action people. But in system where democracy is in earlier stages of implementation, institutional and otherwise, the communities, the people will have to be brought in. So the way we approach this problem is through science policy people interface. So we do a triangular action of integrating that. So a lot of integration goes on, but integration is easier said than done. So normally what people do is they integrate the world with themselves at the center.
Right.
And then that creates problem because whoever is the beneficiary or the people that you work with want to work with the ecosystem, otherwise they don't get the fair role in that. So how do you bring that voiceless, whether the poor, the women, the children, the ecosystem, the species, how do you bring them into the decision-making process right from the grassroots to the global and the international level? That's one of the major challenges.
Sure.
The other challenge is the limitation of science. We do science in textbooks and in the education system, and we never teach our students well enough to take the bigger part of the problems. So climate change is one example, poverty is another, water is one such problem. But very soon, climate change, water, and people, ecosystem get connected very well. For example, in climate change world, in the world of adaptation, one of the highest amount of adaptation will be done in the water sector. And it's too much water, too little water, wrong type of water, and wrong timing for water. These four elements combine about 60–70% of the various adaptations that we'll have to do. Is flood for too much water, drought, too little water, sea level rise, salinity intrusion, wrong type of water. And those are just examples. And wrong time of water, the rainfall not coming in time, not giving the best productivity from the land to agriculture. So future food security, food threats, water security, and all that remains a challenge across, not only in Bangladesh, across the world. In BCAS, our center is working in Africa. We are working in Latin America with partners. So and of course, we have partners across the world in Western countries and research institutes and universities.
Sure. So do you think the lessons you've learned in Bangladesh are applicable to other regions of the world?
Some lessons we learned are the systemic lessons are applicable to some of the areas or many of the areas. Definitely, Bangladesh is one of those places, is one of the highly densely populated, one of the poorest country in the world, with which has had about 6% growth rate for the last 15 years. So has done some very interesting miraculous activities. Its population growth rate has come from 2.1 to 1.45, which is quite miraculous. This has never happened in human history for the women who are mostly non-literate and malnourished are making major global decisions on population growth rate. So fascinating things are happening. The question is, some of them would be applicable somewhere, not everything applicable everywhere.
Sure.
But the learning that we are doing is not only we are learning from Bangladesh and take it outside in the global system of knowledge, but we are taking the knowledge from out of the world and putting it into trying to make the Bangladesh work. For example, Bangladesh is the world leader now in home-based solar systems for the poor.
Right.
We initiated that project. Now it has been replicated. About 500,000 household now has solar photovoltaic for the poorest, who can't even, had never seen a bulb in their lifetime, and now is having lights. So yeah, things are happening, but things are not happening at the rate at which these huge challenges are coming and hitting them, and for which they are not responsible.
Yes.
The critical issue to be understood in terms of climate change is the responsibility initially lies with the industrialized rich countries. Now, of course, as we go on, rapidly industrialized countries like China, India, and others are also, or the population, rich population they're in. In India, for example, 2/3 of the world population is very similar to the poor of Bangladesh. But sometimes their vision or concentration is for the rich.
Right.
And in the global equity justice issue, you know, the whole discussion in the global negotiation is concentrated around money. Now, one of the issues is, yesterday I was talking here about that the fund, we are talking about $100 billion per year from 2020 onward. I mean, $30 billion should be on the table right now. However, our crude calculations show that poorest of the poor across the world are paying more than $100 billion from their own pocket to, you know, get them out of the impacts of climate change. So the poor are paying, the rich are not. However, when there is a Wall Street crisis, at one level government says there is no money with them, the Western governments, OECD governments. But when there is a Wall Street crisis, $1 trillion flows. So there is money, but money for the rich, not for the poor, not for the people who have been victimized and who are suffering the onslaught of climate change.
So one way of engaging private sector money is to encourage investment in renewable energy. Are there any challenges in encouraging private sector investment in renewable energy in Bangladesh?
Yeah, well, private sector has a very important role to play, and they may be able to bring some fund and technologies into the equation. However, let us remember private sector's central motive is profit and access. So they will do things which makes them the highest profit or good profit. Now, many of these systems of poverty doesn't enable them to do. So say in terms of water delivery, they will deliver water at a price at the central urbanized levels where people can pay. But the huge population that who cannot pay the so-called, what is the commercial price, not necessarily the fair price. Fair price will be far, far lower than that. But the commercial price, they won't be able to pay, so the private sector will not go there. Similarly, for the food security of the poor, private sector hasn't done much or will not do much. They might be able to innovate some new seeds, you know, penetrated that to the market. Let us also remember that about good 1/3 of the global population are not in the formal market in the conventional sense of having enough spare cash to enter the market. So that will not be affected by the private sector in the same way. However, the next range where monetary world works and profit making is possible, private sector has a role and can come in play. In the below that level, where most of the poor resides, somehow I think private sector will have some role, selective, but won't be able to play a massive role.
Let's look to the future for a moment. Where do you see Bangladesh in 20 years' time in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation?
By 20 years, not only Bangladesh, many of these present, the intensity of the problem will multiply. And there is a non-linear relationship between the amount of greenhouse gas and the consequent temperature rise to the impacts. Initially, it was sort of for certain amount of greenhouse gas, the atmosphere would take in, the oceans would take in, so we would not feel it. Now I think oceans acidification has already started quite seriously. The atmosphere is somewhat near getting saturated. Everything else will show up as show their thermal responses. Consequently, for a small amount of greenhouse gas emission, there will be much bigger climate impacts. Whether this, and most of it, in terms of development, it will come as a form of extreme event. An extreme event, whether they're cyclones, flood, you know, disproportionate rainfall precipitation or shortage of that in terms of drought, and many of the what we saw in Pakistan more recently, which is unprecedented, the fires in Russia around Moscow, the floods in China, many of these, and of course cyclones in Bangladesh and floods in there. You know, some of the cyclones are 20-year events, but 3 mega cyclone, Ayla, Cedar, and Nargis, came within a period of 2 years. Now, this is violation of all statistics known, and Nargis has killed 160,000 people in Myanmar. So, and then the whole question is, if that cyclone were to happen in Bangladesh, the death fall would be less than 1/20th of that, because Bangladesh has prepared itself with a cyclone warning system and a management strategy with huge number of volunteer workers. So it's a question of mobilizing your society. It's a question of doing now. As to the impacts will be the pressures would be huge coming from climate change. The impacts will depend on 2 conditions. One is what I call the baseline, the state of development. You know, not many rich people die because of the climate-induced natural hazards. On the other hand, it is the absence or their capacity to respond to these, which we are now calling adaptive capacity. Strengthening that would help. So Bangladesh has already taken some initial steps of creating its own fund to look into some of these issues, having a strategy, Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan, which has been done in a participatory way, involved the civil society, government, private sector, NGOs, everybody. You know, now that is there. However, for the, the huge nature of the problem, how big it is, those are small steps. So a lot needs to be done, and there will be severe impact on food security, energy security, water security, livelihood security, and above all, health security of communities. So those all combine together. So we are at one level trying to move in the path of development, and climate change is always suppressing that development path. So development that we would have normally gone into, and the Bangladesh government and the people have a vision of becoming a medium-income country, low-medium-income country by 2020. That vision will be suppressed by the huge impacts of climate change.
So Bangladesh seems to have done a lot in terms of climate change planning. Is there a sense that because it's done so much, there's an opportunity to take that knowledge elsewhere?
2 things on that. One is Bangladesh has been ahead of the game, and that is, partly responsible to research organizations, civil society organizations, government entities, government organizations who have already mobilized their communities and people, which the infrastructure for mobilized communities were there. Now the information of putting in climate change, and for ordinary people, you don't have to say about climate change. They don't talk in terms of climate change. If you ask a farmer, what's going on, he said, something isn't right. We don't understand. The rain isn't coming at the time we wanted. We are ready with the seeds, but we don't know how to sow because it is in the right time that's not coming. One of the other major challenges is the knowledge challenge, which is the present-day farmers, and many of them are non-literate, have the wisdom and tremendous potential and experience of learning from their parents and grandparents, use that knowledge to feed the whole country, not only the whole country, across the world. That's what is happening. Unfortunately, the rapidity with which climate change is taking place and all the adaptation needs that will come within that is going to happen in the future. The previous knowledge will not have linear progression to the knowledge of the future. So a new knowledge system has to come in, and these non-literate people will not be able to quickly understand that knowledge system. So there will be a knowledge gap. And in that gap, we have to learn to operate. Organizations like ourselves and others who make these connections will have a much higher responsibility and greater role in terms of filling that knowledge gap. Otherwise, that knowledge gap will stimulate a food shortage problem, a water shortage problem, essentially will enhance the challenges to development, let alone sustainable development for the future. So, challenges are going to be enormous. The negative approach for most industrialized countries don't help in those situations. So I think the planet as a whole, the governance system, whether it's government, NGOs, has to take much greater cognizance of climate change and its great impact, particularly on the poor countries and poor communities across the world, in rich countries and poor countries. And till we understand that, we are seeding the seeds of dissatisfaction, which in the course of next 20, 30 years will is most likely to show up as a social destabilization and a movement of dissatisfaction, which the present society, we just don't know how to cope. Little destabilization we have seen in the last 10 years, our governments are unable to pretty much understand, cope with it. When millions of people, hundreds of millions of people will be displaced and destabilized because of climate change induced inundation in the coastal areas or drought in severe areas, and people will be displaced. And this, what is now being termed as climate migrant, might have to move and will have to move. We must find a organized plan to do that. I was requested to address the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations on, and I proposed there an organized plan to do with this human migration as early as possible, so that we are not late again and not be able to handle that.
Sure.
Because that dissatisfaction will show up as a huge global threat or a phenomena that the present governance regime just doesn't know how to handle.
Okay, let's hope that won't be necessary. But thank you very much, Atiq, for your time today. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.